talk about the process. I know that the audience is very... Where does a book start for you? I mean, you talked about where Tipping the Velvet came from, but now that you're not working on a PhD, you're not doing research, you have perhaps a bit more sort of open field there. Where does a book start?
Well, I mean, my first three books are all set in the 19th century, and they very much grew out of each other. So with, Tipping the Velvet was my first, and then Affinity, and then Fingersmith. And then I was sort of, each time I'd finish one of those books, I thought, oh, there's another Victorian lesbian story I could tell here, or there's another bit of Victorian life I'd like to explore. So it was very organic growth with those first three. And then then after I finished Fingersmith, the third one, I kind of thought, I don't want to be in the 19th century forever. I don't want to get stuck here. So I thought it would be interesting to make a move. I suppose I wanted to see what would happen to my voice, really, if I did make a move. And I've never wanted to go pre-Victorian. It's never really appealed to me. And I knew a little bit about the 1940s and Britain and London during and after the Second World War. And I knew that some women, especially young women, had actually had quite exciting wartime lives. And I was interested in writing about gay people in this period as opposed to the 19th century, what might have changed. So, that became The Night Watch, a book that's set during and just after the Second World War, which entailed, of course, a whole new load of research, completely different sort of research. And so it's been the same ever since, really. I mean, actually, that book led to another book set in the 40s, which was The Little Stranger. And then I went to the 20s. And it's just something that's taken me to a period. And then what I'll do is, because I think if you're writing historical fiction, there has to be a really good reason for the book to be set in that specific moment. I mean, the worst kind of historical fiction is when you feel it's basically they're modern people in sort of fancy dress. I'm really interested in trying to get at some sort of set of issues that seem to kind of characterize a period or exemplify a period. And certainly with the last book, The Paying Guest, which was set in the 20s, that's exactly what happened. I was interested in the 20s. I didn't really know much about it, but it was only when I went to it, began researching it, and began seeing what an interesting time it was in terms of class and gender and sexuality, that I then began to find characters and a plot that would let me explore those issues, that would somehow exemplify those sorts of tensions and issues. So for me, it always comes out of research, but then there's always a lovely moment when the research kind of gives birth to characters and a plot, and then I slightly leave the research behind, although I always keep going back to it. And then it's about those characters and their particular situation.
I mean, the research that you do, the richness of detail suggests that you do an enormous amount of research into the period, the social mores, the clothing, the streets, the interior decoration, the language, but also the characters' lives. I mean, it hits you in the very first paragraph of Tipping the Velvet when, with all the detail about the Whitstable oyster parlours. So can you give us an insight into how you do your research? I mean, are you sitting at your desk? Is it library work, or are you going out into visiting Victorian prisons, or
well, it's a bit of everything, really. I mean, these days, of course, so much more is online. When I first started with Tipping the Velvet and the next few books, really, it was pretty library based. So I mean, luckily here in London, there's the British Library, and now I'm a member of the London Library as well, which are both great resources. But, so if I wanted to find out about women's underwear in the 1890s, it was going to the British Library, going through the catalogue, which when I first started was a paper catalogue, looking for books that sounded like they might give me some details of women's underwear, calling them up, waiting 24 hours for the books to arrive sometimes if they were off-site. Seems incredible now. Because now, of course, I can just Google women's underwear 1890s and up come 1,000 images, all of them wonderful. It's almost too distracting. It's almost too distracting because you can just go from one link to another. But that has transformed research. But at the same time, it is about visiting properties. I mean, my book before last, The Little Stranger, is a haunted house story set in I had a very particular vision of a sort of Georgian country house. And so I did, I went and visited. I mean, it's a nice day out apart from anything else, but I found houses that, were like the sort of house I wanted to talk about, and, went on day trips with my partner and it was really useful to do that. You can't get that from the internet. You can't get the atmosphere, you know, you can't get the way a light is on a staircase, on a grand staircase, and that sort of thing. So, and of course, lots of my books are set in London. I'm very happy Londoner, so I'll, you know, going for walks is a great resource for me as well. When I was writing The Night Watch, which is set, as I said, during and after the Second World War, you know, I was looking at maps of bomb-damaged streets and, you know, wandering around the areas that my characters were living in and trying to see them as they would have been in the 1940s. Just as, you know, a few years earlier, I'd been looking, all I could see was Victorian London. Suddenly it's shifted for me. So yeah, it's a bit of everything. With the 40s, suddenly I could watch films. You know, I could turn off my computer at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and watch an old black and white movie on telly. Because a great resource for me has always been the fiction from a period, you know, novels from a period.
Right.
Not that novels give you, of course, an sort of unaccessed glimpse of reality, but they definitely give you a sense of the mentality of a period, the vocabulary, the flavour of a period. And you know, films are the same. So that obviously has become a resource since I left the 19th century as well.
I just wanted to, you mentioned the buildings, and in particular in, you know, The Little Stranger, you've got Hundreds Hall there. It feels like the buildings in your novels are more than just places where the action takes place. It almost feels like they're characters. I mean, if you think of Hundreds Hall or Millbank Prison, the theatres in Tipping the Velvet, do you think of them in that way, or do you use them to be more than just settings?
Yes and no. I think it's just that I'm really interested in buildings, you know, and I'm very interested in, but, you know, buildings fascinate me because they're always built at a very particular historical moment for that moment. You know, the sort of ideas about, if you think those big country houses, you know, the posh bits upstairs and the servants' bits downstairs, the attics, you know, the sort of the men's bits, the women's bits, you know, it enacts the kind of social structures of the period in which they're written. Then they're built and time moves on. So they're these weird sort of time capsules, which is one thing I love about them. You know, houses are always kind of haunted in a way, not by ghosts, I don't think, but, you know, just by the period that they're built for, and then they're sort of left there as kind of relics. Any houses, I mean, I'm writing a book that's set in the 50s at the moment, and, you know, 50s houses, they don't have to be very old. They just sort of evoke an awful lot. And I think it's more about, I don't really try and make the buildings characters, but I'm very preoccupied with my characters' experience of living in those spaces, you know, what they would see, what they would overhear. I mean, this became a very live issue for me with my last book, which is The Paying Guests, which is about, you know, 2 households living in one relatively small house, and the 2 women have an affair, a secret affair. So, you know, it was all about, you know, what can the other people overhear, what's going on behind a closed door, you know, what might you hear through the ceiling or passing each other on the staircase. And suddenly the novel was a much bigger player. Yeah, I remember really, really early on realizing that the landing was going to be this site of kind of enormous erotic kind of frisson, because that was the point where my 2 characters were meeting. That was the only sort of space they had until they became lovers and then could go into each other's bedrooms, and that was a whole other thing again. So yeah, I think it's much more about, that's changed
landings forever for me.
It's always about, you know, when I first started writing my novels, it was all about the artifacts. I was just really enchanted, really, with the difference of the past and the fact that clothes and underclothes were different, and it was all the different physical, textual, and is that the word I'm looking for? The texture of things was very different. And actually, as I've sort of matured as a writer, I'm less interested in that in a funny way, and more interested in the emotional dynamics between my characters, because that's where story is. But obviously, I like to think about how my characters are playing out their dramas on this background of a different physical landscape, and really only trying to bring it into play when it's part of the emotional texture of the book.
I think your novels are so intricate, and have moments or turning points that are of such, in some cases, staggering significance. How much of this do you have laid out before you get cracking on the narrative itself?
Well, quite a lot, and the more the better, in terms of how, you know, how straightforward it then makes the writing process. I mean, my most straightforward books have always been the ones where I've had a really clear vision right from the start, both of the plot and of the sort of of the kind of what, you know, the feel of the book, almost the smell, not the smell, but the color of the book, you know, what the sort of facial expression I want the book to produce on my readers. You know, that's what I'm trying to aim at when I'm writing a book, is knowing that and then being able to write towards it. And I don't always know those things when I start, which I always find very unnerving. So I'm happiest once I've settled on a plot and the characters, and the plot almost always comes first, or at least the plot and comes along with the characters, but the characters at that point are very like puppets in a way, you know, that I just know they're going to have to play this role in this particular plot, which sounds a bit kind of cold and calculating, doesn't it? Except that then for me, what happens is that the process of writing the novel is kind of figuring out why those characters are involved in that particular plot, what they're getting out of it, what, you know, the way they might feel sort of conflicted about it, what it means to them. Again, it comes back to the sort of, it's the feelings of the characters. That's where the story is. But yeah, I do like to get the plot pretty much worked out in advance, especially if, I mean, as you've mentioned, you know, a couple of the books have twists or revelations. And sometimes, I mean, in Fingersmith, there's a big twist. And to be honest, the twist was my starting point. You know, I just thought and I kind of stole it actually from Wilkie Collins, but I thought I want to write a book that's got that twist in it. So then it was a question of figuring out, you know, who the players were, what, you know, what their involvement was, how they had got to this point and where they were going to go next. But yeah, I mean, my last book, it's got a kind of murder in it. And, you know, I've often said that I partly wrote that book because I've always wanted to write a novel in which two women have to carry a man's body down the stairs. You know, I love films like Les Diaboliques and things like that. You know, this terrible, or Patricia Highsmith, you know, this terrible state of affairs where you've killed somebody and you've got to dispose of the body, and oh my God, it's awful. And that was, you know, I had such relish in writing those scenes in the book. So it's often once I've realised that a book has that potential, I suppose. You know, I didn't start off with The Paying Guest thinking I'm going to write a 20s crime novel, not at all. It was only when I incidentally began reading about a couple of high-profile 20s crimes that I thought, actually, do you know what, it just was narratively, it was just so exciting, I couldn't resist it. And the same with my haunted house novel, The Little Stranger. I hadn't planned that as a haunted house novel. But when I realised the sort of area I wanted to write about might be best represented as a sort of poltergeist novel, you know, it's just great because suddenly it all began to come alive for me.
When you get started on a novel, or indeed when anyone gets started on a novel, there are always going to be sort of fundamental decisions, structural decisions, separate from the story itself, that can be really hard for inexperienced writers. Things like whether you tell the story in the first person or the third person, whether you use multiple perspectives, or indeed reverse the chronology of the story. And I think you've done all of those in your novels. So I suppose my question is, at what point do you make those kind of fundamental decisions?
Yes, I mean, you said it can be difficult to negotiate that kind of thing for an inexperienced writer, but I think it's difficult for an experienced writer as well, actually. I think I've always been haunted. I've always been haunted. Again, probably not, apart from Tipping the Velvet, where I just had this very clear, it was definitely going to be a sort of coming of age, you know, sort of one girl's maturing sort of story. That was obvious that was going to be a first person narrative. But I think with all of the other ones, I've been haunted for, you know, quite a little way into the writing process with, you know, have I chosen the right person to tell this story? Should this be third person? Should it be first person? You know, that sort of anxiety can linger for a while, and really I find lingers until you just settle into it and understand, I suppose, why you have made that decision. Because I think often that decision gets made unconsciously, I think, well, instinctively, you know. So the times I have written in the third person, it's just, I mean, there's one great advantage to the third person, and that is that your reader doesn't know if your characters are going to end up okay. If somebody's telling the story, then they've survived, you know, in whatever form they've survived. But in a novel like, say the last one, The Paying Guests, where there was an awful lot of jeopardy and peril for my two characters, it seemed more sensible and more, it just seemed right to have it in the third person. So we were never, you know, we weren't going to be sure if they were going to make it.